Dear colleagues and friends, let me start by a warm welcome to all of you. Let me thank the International Finance Forum, its Secretary General Zhang Xingyong, and its Deputy Secretary General Zhuang Joanna, as well as the Paulson Institute, for organizing this event together with the Task Force on Carbon Pricing in Europe. It is great to have these two prestigious think tanks from China and from the US to be part of this online meeting on a subject of utmost importance for the future of mankind. Coping efficiently with climate change rests on the joint endeavors of the three main economic powers, which are as well the three main carbon emitters, the US, China, and the European Union. Even though there is now a large awareness on the major issue we are facing, and that we need to dramatically reduce carbon emissions, all figures show that their amount globally does not stop increasing. And unfortunately, the current energy crisis is accelerating this trend, not only because of the war in Ukraine, which raises major energy challenges in Europe in the first place, but also because of the upward turn of economic activity, which has boosted since last year the demand for energy from fossil fuels in the first place. We are all convinced that giving a significant price to carbon is a prerequisite to succeed in the energy transition. But we all know as well that at least in the years to come, we need complementary measures. Because even though we have to significantly accelerate the production of energy through non-CO2 emitting sources, renewables and nuclear, we must also create incentives for those who are at the heart of emissions, which are firms producing energy from fossil fuels, as well as all the industrial sectors which are emitting carbon in their production processes. The sectors like cement, steel, producer of fertilizers, and so on, in order for them to make the necessary investments to phase out their carbon emission. Carbon capture, use, and storage is without any doubt, if correctly implemented, the best device to reduce carbon emissions, and therefore to start reversing this trend, an urgent obligation for the world. This will need a huge amount of investment for the business concerned to undertake, and therefore huge fundings, which can come only through sectoral carbon pricing. They would create dual incentives to avoid paying for emission permits. These companies would have to make the necessary investment. And second, part of the proceeds could be used to help them retrofit their firms as soon as possible. Such a program is extremely ambitious indeed, but is it not up to the immense task that humanity is facing? This is what the subject we will explore today is so important. And this is why I have to thank all the participants, those who have accepted to bring their contributions, those who will moderate the sessions, and all of you will have the opportunity to take the floor. I count on the speakers to abide by the time allotted to them, and to all of you to make brief interventions. Last but not least, I thank my assistant Joël and Nina Massis through their firm RP. They both have been instrumental in the organization of this event. Now it's time to start. The floor, we start with the first session, and Sylvie.
Good afternoon or very early morning, as I understand everybody. It's a pleasure to participate in this conference. And first, I would like to thank Edmond and his teams for his continuous efforts to put CCUS at the front stage of the fight against climate change, and also to gather stakeholders around the world to debate the key conditions required for the further development of CCUS. COP26 in Glasgow has shown again that reaching the goals of the Paris Agreement will require that all options to decarbonize our economies are deployed rapidly and at scale, and that CCUS will be a critical technology to reach net zero emissions. The war in Ukraine also highlights that the transition from fossil fuels will take time, and decarbonization of energy supplies must be accelerated. We have seen a great momentum for CCUS over the last few years and months. COP26 has raised the awareness of the key role of CCUS in net zero emissions. Glasgow, when it comes to CCUS, has achieved important steps and created favorable conditions for the further development of CCUS. I refer, of course, to the completion of the negotiation of Article 6 that has created a decisive step for the functioning of international cooperation on carbon markets. It's, of course, a big win for the further development of CCUS and CDR technologies. There were also several cooperation agreements on new initiatives. For instance, the US and China agreed to cooperate on CCUS and direct air capture. A new CDR mission and the mission initiative co-led by the US, Saudi Arabia, and Canada was announced. So therefore, there is a new growth momentum for CCUS all around the world. We can see that the number of projects in the pipeline has grown substantially, notably in 2021. We see also that the diversity of applications for CCUS is now enlarged to the full strategic role of CCUS. So not only decarbonizing existing assets like coal power plants, but also reducing emission in hard to abate sectors for which no solution is available at scale today. We see also example of production of low carbon hydrogen to accelerate deep decarbonization policies. And last but not least, we see the first project for the creation of negative emissions through direct air capture and BE-CCS. We have also seen that the interest and investment in CCUS are spreading to more countries all around the world. However, despite this progress, we should not forget that CCUS capacity must increase significantly to achieve net zero emissions, and the pace of large-scale CCUS must be accelerated. This will require the right framework at global and national level. This will require that technical barriers are eliminated, and this will also require that an effective business case is developed. This is mainly the themes that will be discussed today. To set the scene for this conference, this introductory session will give an appraisal of CCUS at global level and what is needed to accelerate the recent momentum. To do that, we have two distinguished speakers from renowned global institutions. Mathilde Fajardi from the International Energy Agency and Gülören Turan from the Global CCS Institute. Mathilde is a CCUS and energy analyst at the IEA, and she has a thorough knowledge of CCS and CDR technologies, notably applied to BE-CCS. Gülören is General Manager for Advocacy and Communications at the Global CCS Institute. She is responsible for the Institute advocacy team globally, including its international climate policies activities. Mathilde and Gülören, it's a pleasure to have you today with us. And we look forward to hearing your talk. Now, Mathilde, please, the floor is yours.
Well, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you, and for the kind introduction as well. So my name is Mathilde Fajardi, and I work at the International Energy Agency, as just said. I think most of you are aware with the IEA, with what we do. So we work with governments and industry to shape a secure and sustainable energy future for all. And so in order to do so, we explore the role of different fuels and technologies to achieve this goal. And so my presentation today is really a broad overview of CCUS technology, why we need it for clean energy transitions, and also just the current state of play. Just to briefly introduce the technology, CCUS is really a suite of technology which spans a large portfolio of applications. It starts with capture, either from point sources, such as fossil or biomass fuel power stations and industrial facilities, or directly from the air. Then CO2 is transported by ship, pipeline, or truck, or different modes to either storage, which is where CO2 is injected in rock formations deep below ground, or below the seabed if we're talking about offshore storage. And if CO2 is not stored, it can also be utilized as a feedstock for products which would have otherwise used fossil hydrocarbon, such as chemicals or fuels, or it could also be used in building aggregates. So that's what we called utilization. And so why do we talk about CCUS? And really this slide will illustrate what Sylvie just presented to us as to CCUS key role in net zero. So last year, the IEA released a report on how to reach net zero emissions by 2050 globally. And this figure here illustrates how much we need CCUS in key sectors. So we see a major scale up of CCUS reaching about 4 billion tons of CO2 capture by 2035 and almost 8 billion tons of CO2 capture by 2050. And as Sylvie just said in our presentation, the roles that we see for CCUS are fourfold. We first see that CCUS has to be retrofitted to existing power and industrial plants to avoid the early costly retirement of these assets. And so this is what you see as some of the CCUS contribution in the power sector and the industry sector. The second role for CCUS is really for heavy industry, for existing but also new heavy industry, because CCUS is virtually the only technology solution for deep emissions reduction from cement. And it's also the most cost-effective approach in many regions for steel and chemicals. And so this is why you see a large role for CCUS in industry in our model. First, the third role is hydrogen. We see CCUS as an enabler of least cost, low carbon hydrogen production, as we see the role of hydrogen to be able to decarbonize other parts of the energy sector. This is, of course, in combination with hydrogen from electrolysis. And finally, for emissions that cannot be avoided or reduced directly, CCUS can provide carbon dioxide removal when combined with bioenergy, so either biofuel or biopower, but also with CO2 directly captured from the air with direct air capture. And so overall, where are we today with CCUS? So carbon capture facilities, it's important to stress that they've been operating since the 1970s, but progress has been slow since then. We're today capturing around 40 million tons of CO2 per year, but there have been strong climate targets and investment incentive, which have, as Sylvie said, really been injecting new momentum into CCUS. We've seen an impressive ramp up in project announcements since 2021. We have over 160 projects announced since 2021, and this is very encouraging. Obviously, they still falls short of how much we need, how much deployment of CCUS we need by 2030. So we still need more efforts. And the second important point is that projects in planning are still going to require financial incentive and political support to go ahead, as we've seen in the past, many projects being announced and then being cancelled. So this doesn't mean that that CCUS doesn't need financial incentive and political support. Another encouraging trend is the diversification of CCUS projects across regions and application. Today, the majority of large-scale CCUS facilities come from natural gas processing plants because it's a low-cost application of CCUS, mostly in the US. What we see today is that first, on the left, the project pipeline is really diversifying across applications. We see hydrogen, power, and biofuels leading CCUS developments. And in terms of region, the US is still very present in the project pipeline, but we now see Europe being a key leader of CCUS development, and Asia also really rising to the challenge with over 10 large-scale projects in China. And overall, we have projects being developed and announced in over 30 countries. A key question which is often asked for CCUS is it too expensive? And what we like to answer to this is, well, first, the cost of CCUS varies greatly across applications, depending on flue gas concentration. And while there's been a great deal of focus on coal power, other applications such as hydrogen and bioethanol, for example, are lower cost opportunities for CCUS development and can really help jumpstart the industry. A second remark is that this cost of CO2 capture and transport and storage has to be compared to other abatement technology and what's available in the portfolio. And actually running the IEA net zero scenario with limited CCUS incurs a dramatic increase in the cost of meeting this target. It increases the cost by about 15 trillion. So really it is an expensive technology because it's a cost on your facility, but it has to be compared with meeting net zero without CCUS. An important element in the cost structure of CCUS is also infrastructure, CO2 transport and storage. And a key opportunity for cost reductions in CCUS is really through leveraging shared infrastructure. So another encouraging trend that we've seen is the clustering of CCUS projects within industrial hubs. We have over 50 hubs in development today, with the majority being in Europe. And for that, spatial analysis and sourcing matching can really help identify these hubs and opportunities for shared infrastructure. And so this is an example of some work we did for China last year, where we showed that a good deal of existing power and industrial facilities were found within 50 to 100 kilometers of potential storage, and that a network of around 15,000 kilometers of CO2 trunk lines could help connect emission sources, sinks, and ports. So this is all encouraging, and this is good momentum behind CCUS. Obviously, government and industry action is still critical to make this happen this decade. We see 4 different rules for governments and industry. Governments and industry needs to create the conditions for investment by placing a value on reducing emissions and by providing direct support for early CCUS projects. There's also importance in coordinating and underwriting the development of industrial hubs with shared CO2 infrastructure. There's a great need for identifying and encouraging the development of CO2 storage. To this day, CO2 storage characterization and permitting remains one of the key bottlenecks of CCUS deployment. So this is a key area of focus. And finally, while CCUS has been operating for years in chemical absorption, there's still a need to boost innovation in critical technologies that could lower the cost of capture, especially in sectors where emissions are hard to abate, such as cement or for carbon removal. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mathilde, for sharing with us this encouraging thought about the future of CCUS. And it's really very encouraging to see that the project pipeline is increasing very fast, month after month. Now, I would like to give the floor to Güleren Turan, who is going to share a view from the Global CCS Institute. Güleren, please.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Sylvie, and thank you very, very much, Edmund, Nina, and all the organizers for including us today. For those of you who may not be familiar with the Global CCS Institute, we are an international think tank, climate think tank that aims to accelerate the deployment of carbon capture, use and storage as a key climate technology. And we're headquartered in Melbourne, Australia, but we have offices around the world, including Belgium and UK and Washington, DC, China, and of course, Japan as well. What I'm going to say, I suppose good news or bad news, is going to very much mimic what Mathilde said. We are a sister organization to, of course, IEA as well, and we rely a lot on some of their analysis, and they take and use our database as well. And I think kind of we're all here because CCS is so important for the future of climate. But what is CCS? As Mathilde said, we refer to it as a set of technologies that capture CO2 from either large emission sources or from the atmosphere and store them durably, long-term or ideally permanently, either underground, deep underground in geological formations, or again, durably in products. And we're using it to refer, as I mentioned, to a broad suite of technologies. So this can be point source capture to, let's say, direct air capture, including geological storage and durable utilization in products. Carbon capture and use and storage is a versatile technology, and it's probably one of the facts that makes it so unique, makes it a unique tool in our climate toolkit, that it can help both reduce emissions, mitigate emissions, but it can also help facilitate removing existing historic emissions from the atmosphere. So CCS can reduce emissions, as Mathilde said, from industry, from power generation, or for hydrogen production. But it also enables negative emissions, which we'll need to generate to get to net zero through bioenergy with carbon, coupled with carbon capture, or from direct air capture from the atmosphere, again, combined with use or storage. And as such, it's an essential tool, as I mentioned, in our toolkit in terms of tackling climate change. Now, numerous organizations, numerous very credible and esteemed organizations have concluded that one cannot achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement without a substantial role for carbon capture and storage. And I think in this regard, probably the IPCC's 1.5 report was a game changer, which showed that conclusively we need carbon capture and storage. In fact, in 4 of the pathways that were depicted in the IPCC report, they all have carbon dioxide removal from the atmosphere. And 3 of the 4 pathways, and you see a little graph on the right-hand side, they all require significant amounts of CCS, and the graph shows that there's 3 different pathways and how much CCS is required across these scenarios. Similarly, and as we heard from Mathilde, IEA also sees a major role for CCS. In their sustainable development scenario, they suggested that up to 15% of global emissions could be abated through CCS. And in the more recent net zero report that they released, which I think was last year, again, as Mathilde said, they're sort of seeing between some 4 billion tons of CCS by 2035 and even more, around 7 to 8 gigatons by 2050. So I guess we know we need CCS, and we know that we need a lot of CCS. So where are we today in terms of where we are with CCS? And as the Institute, we've got a database. We follow all the CCS facilities around the world. We've got a database of commercial facilities as well as more pilot scale demo facilities as well. And each year we release a global status of CCS report. The bar chart that you see on the left-hand side, and in fact, this is what a version of what Mathilde showed, shows the data from last year's report. This report was released in 2021. On the right hand, I added the March 2022 because there have been even more additions in 2022 after we released the report, showing that the momentum is continuing. And in fact, as you can see, the pipeline of facilities in the CCS database has been growing since 2017, year on year. Some impressive growth numbers that we're seeing, around 30% each year of new facilities that are being added to the database. Now, as we stand today in early June, there are 29 commercial, what we call commercial large-scale facilities in operation around the world. These are capturing and injecting around 40 million tons of CO2 per year, the 29 operating facilities. And sometimes people say, oh, 40 million tons, that's not too much. Look at the global emissions sort of in the 40 gigatons, etc. But actually 40 million tons is more than energy-related emissions of some countries. And we've found that we see that 40 million tons is more than the emissions of New Zealand. It's more than, let's say, the emissions of Denmark. It's more than the emissions of Ireland. So even when people sort of say 40 million tons is not that much, in a sort of to put it into perspective, it's actually a sort of considerable amount of CO2 abatement from existing CCS facilities. There are currently 141 facilities, commercial facilities that are under development in different stages of development, early stage, advanced, and under construction, bringing the number of commercial facilities globally to around 170. And this does not include sort of more pilot scale or demonstration projects. Much of this growth is happening in North America, particularly in the US and of course in Canada, but also there's a lot of momentum where we're based in Europe, where both regions, governments have, I think, sort of most supportive policies towards CCS. But I'm happy to report that growth is happening pretty much all around the world, but particularly also focus on Middle East, China, and we're seeing increased interest from Southeast Asia. And I'm also happy to report that we are having new countries emerging, kind of entering the CCS scene. And in 2021, we saw for the first time new commercial facilities being announced and sort of starting development in countries like Belgium, Denmark, Hungary, Sweden, and Italy, but also Indonesia and Malaysia. So these are the kind of the first time that we're seeing commercial facilities start activity. And when I mean activity, it's development activity in these countries. So just coming back to sort of what's driving this momentum, and those of us that have been in the climate space for a long time, of course, remember that CCS has been around for a while and has not perhaps taken off in the past to the extent that we wanted to or we thought it would. So what's different, or is it different this time? What's different this time? And I'd like to propose that it's actually very different this time. First and foremost, of course, the net zero commitments from countries and companies, I think that makes a big difference. We know that more than 8% of global emissions are covered by some net zero target, which I think makes a big difference. This has resulted in a virtuous cycle whereby governments are putting in place supportive policies for CCS in many countries. There is increased interest in carbon removal and in hydrogen, particularly blue hydrogen, which is again increased the interest in CCS. And in response, private sector is, I think, rising to the challenge. They're developing more fit for purpose business models, which will be the further topic of discussion later today. We see the rise of CCS networks, which enable a reduction of risk and reduction of cost. And we are also seeing emergence of strategic partnerships, which, one perhaps between some unconventional, what would have been considered unconventional partners, such as United Airlines and Microsoft, to further develop and utilize carbon capture and use and storage technology. So there are a number of interconnected factors in play that are leading to the acceleration of CCS around the world. And despite all of this, despite significant progress since the chart I showed since 2017, nevertheless, we need more and we need to act with urgency. CCS capacity needs to scale, operating CCS capacity needs to scale from 40 million tons today by at least 100-fold to 4 to 8 gigatons, let's say between those numbers, so gigaton scale by 2050. So we've got the next 30 years to scale up CCS capacity by at least 100-fold if we're to meet climate targets. We estimate that this would require capital investment globally around the magnitude of $1 trillion US, roughly, give or take. So it's a challenge, but let's not forget it's also a big business opportunity. for industries around the world. And we see this happening through a sort of a three-pillar or a three kind of like a triangle of sort of stakeholders, with governments, of course, are to establish appropriate policies in order to help create the business case and support CCS development, industry to build, own and operate CCS facilities at scale and develop fit-for-purpose business models, and the finance sector to enable all of this by including CCS in their portfolios, in their taxonomies, to include consideration of CCS in their ESG considerations. So three sort of main stakeholders, and Mathilde already touched upon some of the policy drivers that we think are needed, but not least, of course, carbon pricing being a major kind of component of government policy that's required around the world. So just to conclude, strong policy coupled with strong action in the next 10 years by 2030 is crucial for CCS and is crucial for climate action around the world. With that, I'd like to thank you all.
Thank you very much, Lauren. It was also to share also your optimism about the future development of CCUS. I don't think that there is time for question of answers. So I will now hand over to Mr. Zai Yongping, who will moderate the first session of this conference on technical challenges.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Sylvie. As Sylvie introduced, my name is Yongping Zai. A little bit self-introduction, self-promotion. I've been working at the Asian Development Bank for the last 20 years and plus, and find my new job, first job back in China since less than a year. In both places, in ADB and my new job at the Tencent, one of the key internet giant in China, hopefully globally, we both companies, both places are working on CCUS. I think that made me eligible to be a moderator for this session to talk about technical challenges of CCUS. In the agenda, we had three speakers, but Mr. Lamberto Edering from Equinor has to excuse himself for medical reasons. So we have two speakers for us. So we have actually more time to talk about the CCUS technology challenges. We have, first of all, Ms. Graciela Cicilniski, founder and CEO of Global Thermostat. And we have Mr. Xu Dong from China Energy Corporation in charge of CCUS in the company. So with two speakers, it's about an hour, but less, since we're running a bit late. I would like to run a first round of questions to both of our speakers. Since both of you are clearly in the field, working directly with technologies, with the application of these technologies specifically, and do you feel the momentum that has been mentioned by our earlier speakers, whether this is a real momentum for CCUS technology, and whether this momentum will be sustainable, because we're talking about CCUS technology being important by turn of, around 2050. So whether we'll be able to sustain this momentum until that time, and making sure that CCUS will make the contribution that will be required. I would like to start with Ms. Graciela, founder and CEO of Global Thermostat. Floor is yours first, Graciela, please, Ms.
Thank you very much, Yongping Zai, and thank you very much to Edmond for the organization of this event, which is very timely, very important. The issue that I wanted to discuss is whether First of all, can we resolve the problem of climate change now, after all the delays we have? And if we can, what can be expected? How much it will cost? And what scientific changes are needed for this to take place? And interestingly enough, what business changes have to take place? So it's not just a scientific matter, it's not just a policy matter, it's also a business matter. Just to introduce myself briefly, without too much promotion, as Yongping said, I was there at the beginning when I introduced the carbon market of the Kyoto Protocol. That was just 1996 and 1997. And when we introduced the carbon market, it seemed to be very strange to have a market to trade the requirement of limiting emissions, or rather to have a market to trade the right to emit and to pay for that. But that is critical. And having a market and having a business in that area has proven to be the only way in the entire world that humans were able to significantly decrease the emissions of CO2 in a consistent way. That was done in the European Union. Even though the market that I created and I wrote into the Kyoto Protocol was written in Kyoto, but it was mostly developed in many ways in the United States. But it was the European Union who had the policy and is the only organism internationally who was able to achieve its objectives of decreasing emissions by using the carbon market. It's extraordinary. And it is a market, and it is a business solution, and that's was needed, and that happened. And I think the Europeans deserve the gratitude of the entire planet for having done so. And now we are faced with the fact that, as you know, that's not enough anymore, because the rest of the world accelerated the emissions of CO2. And the problem is that decreasing emissions, which was successfully achieved after 20 years in the European Union emission trading system, is no longer enough. It's too late for that. So what we need now is not to reduce emissions. Emissions are the flow of CO2 that we put in the atmosphere. We had to reduce the flow, but that's not enough anymore. Now, we had to take the legacy emissions out of the atmosphere. We went too far out. We have to remove what's already there. I call that legacy emissions. The emissions that we made before, we had to remove now. And that leads to carbon removal. It's no longer decreasing the flow of emissions, it's looking at the emissions that are already there, the legacy emissions, and removing it from the atmosphere, which is an extraordinary thing to do. We had to scrap the atmosphere. It seems impossible. It may be impossible, but it doesn't have to. We should be able to do it. I am going to start from the end. How much money do we need to do that? And to be very blunt and very simple, we need $2 to $3 trillion to increase the productivity of the technology that already exists to remove CO2 from air. And you will say, why from air? There is more concentrated CO2 in factories and in a number of emission places, but it's not good enough. You need to remove it from air because what you need is to reduce the global concentration of CO2. So you need to actually go to the atmosphere, which has very, very diluted CO2, 400 parts per million approximately, and remove it from air. If you remove it from the concentrated sources, that's great. Everything is great, by the way. Everything that we can do, we should do. But in terms of priorities, the IPCC has admitted, and so does the National Academy of Sciences in the United States, we have to take out the CO2, the legacy CO2 that is already in the atmosphere. We have to scrap the atmosphere. And that is why at least $2-3 trillion are needed for this process. What we need is to lower the cost. And you say, how are we going to lower the cost or increase the efficiency, which is the same in this case? And the only way to do that is by scaling up. Technology people know that that is the only solution. In other words, to remove so much CO2 and to do it so many times that learning by doing, we end up with lower cost, doing it better than we ever done it before. Is it possible? Yes. The history of technology creation and technology efficiency and technology evolution says not only is possible, it is certain it will work. All we need to do is to do enough of it, learning by doing. So we can, if we do enough, we learn enough, we will get the efficiency we need. It is, however, a stretch. Humans never have removed anything from the atmosphere in this quantity that is being required here, and from air. So if you saw the material that was already presented, I don't need to repeat it. We need to remove gigatons of CO2. A gigaton is 1 million tons of CO2, billion tons of CO2. So we need to remove several gigatons of CO2 from the atmosphere. Now, the European Union emission trading system that courageously brought forward the trading of CO2 emissions, which succeeded in doing so, is not enough anymore because it was designed to lower emissions and it succeeded, but it's not sufficient anymore. Now what we have to remove is legacy CO2, not emissions. Emissions are the flow, what we emit every year. Now we need to remove what's already there, legacy. And that is why $2 or $3 trillion is required. I used to think the numbers were impossibly high. I don't think it's impossibly high. I think we can do it. I think that we are spending, in terms of policy, humans are spending comparable amount of money in things that are not nearly as important. This is a question of survival of humankind. So we need several things, but from the technology point of view, there is only one thing that is needed. We don't need to prove it's possible. It is possible. We don't need to prove that we can do it. We're doing it. We need to show that it can be done at a low enough cost that we can remove enough CO2 and the removal can increase to the point that we take out gigatons of CO2, billions of tons every year. The numbers vary, but there is no discrepancy among all scientists in the world that we need to remove the CO2 and how much is needed approximately. Therefore, all we have to do is to put together the science, which we already know how to do, the removal of CO2, and the economics or business, which is the numbers, the dollar value to get this done. Now you may say, okay, that's all you have to do. That sounds great. No. It is the most difficult thing for humans to do, to put together two disciplines that in our educational system don't talk to each other. And in a way, the separation between economics and business on the one hand, and physics and chemistry and the sciences on the other, that division that may seem to be simple is a fundamental division that exists in our brains, in our culture, in our society, and it is the main reason the human species may end up disappearing. Because we cannot put inside our brain two disciplines which are so different according to us. So what am I saying here? It's simple. I'm saying we do have the science. I'm saying we do have the money. We have the economics. We have the business. I am saying humans don't seem to put two disciplines together as needed for this to succeed. What does it take to put the two disciplines together? I've been thinking a lot about it, as you can imagine, since I created the carbon market, 25 years ago, and it succeeded. I've been thinking, what do we need to do now? Unfortunately, it's a revolution in our brains, in the way we think. The way we think separates science from money and business. Now, you may say, okay, never mind, put it together. No, it doesn't work like that. Culture and the way humans think are the reason we are in this dilemma. We can solve it, but the difficulty of solving it is inside our brains. It's our inability to take two different disciplines and put them together and to work together on them. We are unable to do that. And because of that, the human species may disappear. It's as simple as that. And it's perverse. It's historically correct, however, that our divisions inside our brain are causing divisions in our ability to both deal with money and money issues on the one hand, and deal with science, chemistry, and physics on the other. There was recently a movie that was criticized for being too simplistic called Don't Look Up. And it was criticized because it was supposed to be too simplistic in its approach. It was true, it had elements of parody, but it was very deep, because in the middle of the movie, there was this asteroid about to hit the planet Earth, and there was the president of the United States, a woman, finally, maybe just in the movies, but it did happen.
Thank you.
Yeah, so then in that situation, the desire of the policy was to put together the two facts, the science, and destroy the asteroid so that it wouldn't destroy planet Earth. And the reason it didn't work is because the president of the United States in that movie discovered that there were trillions of dollars in the meteorite worth of rare gases and rare materials. And there was so much money to be made from allowing the meteorite to arrive to Earth, more money than the total GDP of the planet. So as a result, nobody wanted to destroy the meteorite, and they preferred to let it continue and destroy the human species.
Thank you.
We are running out of time.
Yeah, thank you. It's Chris. What you're saying is so fascinating to me, that we have a legacy problem, and we have a technology. We need $2-3 trillion, and we have things to solve this problem. But the problem is not technology challenges. You talk about culture challenges, putting two disciplines together. Actually, I was on the money side 2 years ago. Now I'm on the science side. So I hope that by talking together, like the forum today, we bring people together and think together, we have a chance to get out of this. Thank you, Ms. Graciela. I would like to thank you. I may have a question to come back to you after we hear from Mr. Xu Dong, officer in charge of CCOS in China Energy Corporation. I understand Mr. Xu Dong has a PPT presentation, so please load it on the screen, please. Mr. Xu Dong.
Thank you, Mr. Tsai. Hello, guys. Nice seeing you. I'm going to do a short introduction to the development of CCS in China and some CCS projects in our China Energy.
Yep, you can make it full screen, please. Yeah. Okay.
Is it clear now?
Yes, yes.
Okay, thank you. So, so I will give a short introduction to the both parts, CCS in China and CCS in China Energy. The first part, I'm going to show this part is, I think everybody knows that our China's carbon neutrality initiative by 2060, that's a big move. Everybody knows about it, and I want to show this interesting chart. So this shows that from carbon peaking until carbon neutrality, or in US and European, it's called net zero carbon. So for Europe, it has 71st years to these long years to make carbon to slow down the carbon emissions. For US, it has 43 years. However, let's see China, from the carbon peaking in 2030 until 2060, we only have 30 years. So even though sometimes people say that why China put 2060 as the year to achieve carbon neutrality, because we only have 30 years to achieve this goal. Also, as we all know that China has the largest carbon emissions all over the world. So that's a big challenge still, even though that's 2060, it's not 2050. This chart shows that about the result of energy transformation in China. So as we know, coal, coal is very important in China. But however, until 2060, the percentage of coal will slow down fantastically. However, there will be still 7% of coal left, because we know coal is so important to the energy structure in China. So how to do this part? I think at this time, CCS will be quite important to make equipped with coal or power plant together to make a net zero emissions. Sorry. So this is the IEA chart made as idea, the scenarios. So it says that CCS will contribute at least 15% among all of the different carbon emission reduction process. So it means CCS is important technology. So let's have a basic look to the CCS projects in China. So until by 2021, about 35 CCS demonstration projects has been completed. But however, we only with a capacity of over 3 million tons per year. All over the world, the figure is 40 million. So at the earliest days in China, the contribution from CCS is still limited. Why? Let's show this pie chart first. Among all the different CCS products, most of the percentage is CO2 capture projects. Also, at this part, CCS from electricity or say power plant occupies the most. from all of the another thing is that as calculated until this year, the number has been increased greatly. So roughly there have been around 70, at least over 60 projects, including the under construction CCS projects that are under built. So the characteristic in China's CCS projects is there are few large-scale commercial demonstration products. Also, only we are like of the full process integration, and also the big scale. The big scale is not very much. So far we don't have the CO2 offshore storage. The other part is the foundation for CCS technology in the field of steel and the cement is still weak. So roughly I calculate that there are at least 6 different challenges for China to develop the CCUS projects. Challenge 1, China has the largest total CO2 emissions. By 2020, the figure is around 1,000 million tons per year, accounting for around 30% of the over the world. So this is huge. So that's why in China, it is quite challenging to do the CCS to make CO2 emissions down. Challenge 2, huge investment and operational energy consumption. So consumption. So later I will have roughly introduce based on our China analysis projects. Challenge 3, we lack of the business model of the whole industry chain in integrating with capture, transportation, utilization, storage, and monitor, etc. So we don't have the very good industry chain. It means that, for example, if we do CO2 capture projects from power plants, how to treat the captured CO2 is another challenge. Challenge 4, we have the limited policy support in carbon capture. So far, we don't have, as we know, we don't have the carbon tax or the CCUS initiative from the government. If compare with the solar wind and wind development, because that the renewables at the earliest stage at the beginning of the industry, government has give sort of initiative, then it is quite useful for the whole industry to start up. However, so far as CCUS we don't have, but I think I'm sure later China's government is doing actions to give more reality policies supporting. Challenge 5, CO2 source and ink are mismatched. That is like challenge 3. That's similar. So it's the source and sink doesn't match very well. The last challenge, the large scale CO2 utilization technology is not yet mature. It means so at the early stage we think CO2 CCU is kind of easier compared with CCS, because whatever the type of utilization technology. So then the doing CCUS can give some subsidies. However, if we just do CCS, the capture will cost money, storage cost money, so it will give a high burden to the industries. The last one is the development prospect of CCUS technology in China. So I quite like this chart. So only 2 important and interesting turning points. this is turning point 1 in 2030. It means the blue line is the cost of CCS. So it shows that until 2030, the CCS cost will decrease greatly. And another turning point is in 2040. Oh, sorry, I forgot to translate this table into English. So let me explain. So this is the right line, means the CCUS amount, the CO2 reduction amount by CCUS. So this is another turning point. Since 2040, the carbon emissions by CCUS is increasing largely. So another one, I will give a quite quick introduction to our analysis CCUS projects. So far, there are 3 large CCUS projects in China Energy. First one is the CO2 storage project that finished. This project is set up at 2011 and finished by 2013. So far already run at around 10 years, and also so far it is still the only one large CO2 storage that's a cycling aquarium storage projects in China. The scale is 100,000 or 0.1 million tons CO2 per year. Altogether, it stores 0.3 million CO2 underground. Because this project is operated 10 years ago. So originally the cost is 240 RMB. So if we have roughly calculate if this project increased until a million, the scale increase up to 1 million, and the cost will get down and by 150 RMB. Another important CO2 project is China Energy Jingjie CO2 capture demonstration project. It is completed last year. So the scale is 0.15 million. So far, that's the largest one CO2 capture project from power plants by far in China. And there is a very interesting, I think at this technology, we have some kind of new processes, including interface cooling process, classified desorption process, and MVR. So this all of the describes is kind of technological. Sorry about that. Also, we have the new materials, that's new absorbents, also new equipment. So I think the interesting table is here. So that's the interesting part that the audience today, you guys will curious about this. This is a comparison of products in China and out of China. The first one, that's the only 2 CO2 capture projects from power plants. Well, Boundary Dam in Canada, 1 million scale. The total cost is quite high, over $100. And also the energy consumption is quite high, 3.8 gigajoule per ton CO2. Another one in US, but I heard this project has been stopped because of the COVID-19. Petronova, the scale is so far the largest in the world, 1.4 million. The total cost is slowed down to $65, and the energy capacity is 2.4. That's acceptable and that's a good one. And so let's say another 2-1 in China. Huaneng's first one in Shanghai. The scale is 0.12 tons. Originally, the price is 300 to 400 RMB. Equals, I think it equals around 40 US dollars and 2.7 gigajoule. So lastly, let's see the Jingji. Our China Energy is Jingji power, Jingji projects at the scale, as I said. However, let's see the cost. The total cost is only around 30 US dollars, and we have achieved the lowest energy conversion. That's around 2.3 gigajoule. So far, we can in China build the cheapest CO2 capture projects all over the world compared with any projects in of the world. Also, we can achieve the lowest energy consumption of the world.
But Mr. Xudong,
the cost is reduced.
We can have some discussion, please. Yeah. Okay. Go ahead quickly. Yeah.
Okay, last one is that we also right now we are doing another the largest one in China CO2 capture project that's in Taizhou power plant, Jiangsu province. The scale is 0.5 million a year. Right now, our group is in charge of this project and is under construction. We will finish this project by early next year. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Xudong. So encouraging, see so many activities happening in China and also in your company. So we still have about 10 minutes to have discussions. I would like to invite questions from my fellow expert in the panel, in the audience. If you want to raise a question, you can write it down in the chat box, or you can raise your hand for a quick question. I will start with the first question from myself to Ms. Graciela. That do you consider the direct air capture will be the last resort in achieving whatever we want to achieve in this climate action? So the question the other way is whether we can afford to nurture the technology and wait until this technology is demanded in several decades, or it's urgent action that we need to deliver today. What's your view? Whether it is a last resort thing?
It is the last resort, and it is urgent action that is needed today. And it's difficult to explain because people think that the CO2 in the air is very diluted, so it doesn't matter very much. But it's the only way to decrease the overall concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. The atmosphere has CO2 that is uniformly distributed. So if you remove CO2 from one spot, you are removing it from the whole atmosphere. That is now the only solution to climate change. I try to explain that from the point of view of the National Academy of Sciences, and more important, from all the scientists at the IPCC who have agreed on that. And what's needed for that is, from the business point of view, from the money point of view, if you wish, to create a carbon removal market, because the market that we have is for carbon emissions, and that doesn't suffice. We need to have a market where we trade the right to remove CO2, not just to decrease emission, remove the legacy CO2, and it has to be compensated very seriously, both for governments and for the private sector, and it has to be done right now. And if we don't do it right now, the time will not be enough. Mm-hmm. This is how urgent it is.
Thank you. We have a question from Mr. Franz, please, and Mr. Junho afterward.
Thank you very much. This was very interesting. But for example, there are other options also. For example, we in Austria, we have the biggest biogas plant in Austria, and upgrading biogas for the gas grid, you need to remove the CO2, and they have built glass houses near the biogas plant, and they are pumping the CO2 into the glass houses as a sort of fertilizer which helps grow the plants. So this is an unconventional, but it's a positive thing to do. And we should use also all this unconventional stuff also to reduce CO2. Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that it has been confirmed that everything has to be done, and conventional or unconventional is needed. However, I want to emphasize at this point, unless we remove the legacy CO2, which is already in the air, the IPCC has decided it's not enough to do anything else if we don't remove the CO2, which is already in the air. That is, direct air capture is a necessity now. It has to be done. I can go in more detail about that, but that is the essence of the issue. It's not that we should stop doing other things, but we should consider that if we don't remove the CO2 which is already there, it will not suffice by the end of the century to remove sufficient CO2 from the atmosphere as a whole to detain the march of climate change that is, as we know, more dangerous than all nuclear warfare for the survival of our species.
Okay, Mr. Junho, please, and then Mr. Tony Lee.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Juho Lipponen from the Clean Energy Ministerial CCUS initiative. Graciela, thank you for your talk. Can you tell what type of technical improvements you see that you would have to make in the direct air capture community as a whole, and or with global thermostat in particular, to significantly reduce the cost? Or is it all really actually down to scaling up and building bigger and bigger? And then Shudong, very interesting, the price comparison between different projects. What's your view? Why can China make it so much cheaper? Thank you.
The scaling seems to be a different issue from the technology improvements. But I need you to understand that the only way that big changes have occurred in technology is not by having breakthroughs, is by size, by learning by doing curves, which simply decrease the cost overall of the technology sufficiently for it to happen, and to happen at the scale that is needed. There is no other way. So it is not only that we need to remove a lot, it is that for every aspect of the technology improvement, particularly the time that it takes to capture, because the time is going to determine how much we can remove of the CO2. So the time that it takes to capture will be reduced only, listen to this, only by scaling up. I know it sounds strange, but this is true, and it's true in the history of technology. So in some sense, I say that China has a historical role because they can scale up at that level, and they can do it technologically. There is a confluence of those two approaches that is now needed. And unless we understand that and we actually do it, our species is not going to survive.
I understand your answer. But the question going to Mr. Shudong, that how China made it cheaper, even the scale is not that big.
Okay, what you need to have is you need to develop the chemical products that are going to bind to the CO2 so that it can be removed.
Yeah.
And these chemical products, again, they only operate by trying, failing, trying and failing, by having enough scale that you will actually decrease the cost of the sorbents. A sorbent, S-O-R-B-E-N-T, is essentially similar but different from a catalyst. Because it mixes with the CO2, it allows the process to happen.
Thank you, Ms. Graciela.
There is no other way than to do it enough times until you succeed.
I want to ask your colleague, Mr. Xudong from China, to give his part of answer, feedback.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
How China made it.
Thank you, my friend Yuho. Nice seeing you. Good question. And let me give you a quick answers to that. I have seen your questions on the screen. The total investment is, I think, convert to US dollars is around 45 millions. Yeah, this skill. And also why it's so cheap in China. We can do this. I think there are some reasons. One is because we do the lots, the skill up. Skill up can really help decrease the total capture capital cost. Also, during the, because our team, we have the Ccs energy experience until when it's not only copied to Taizo's product, we don't give the whole product, the whole system so tight and make it as small as we can. So still we can have the 500K tons, the skill. That's one reason. Another reason that's as we all know that China has the most cheap labors. Also, another reason is that all of the equipment by this product, we all purchased the equipment from inside China. We didn't buy any overseas equipment. The last reason is from the lower chemicals we use. So I think that's basically all the main reasons that we can achieve, we can do to achieve the lowest CO2 investment, capture investment of the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Xudong, for that answer. Very clear. Mr. Tony Lee, please, your turn for possibly last question before we hand the session back to Chief Moderator. Yeah. Tony, do you have a question? You're raising your hand. Actually, I have see your, yep. Okay, I can't hear Tony, but he wrote in the chat box for Mr. Xudong, the new 500K ton per year CCUS project is much bigger than current project scale. How much does China invest in this project, and what's your estimated average sequestration cost in RMB? So you may have already answered this question, I'm not sure.
I answered the first question. That's roughly calculate the investment is around 45 million US dollars.
25.
45.
45 million.
45 million. I'm not quite sure because I have to transfer the Chinese money into US dollars.
Understand.
Yeah, but it's quite cheap. Yeah,
tricky.
Would be around 45 million US dollars.
Okay, so yeah. If we don't have further question, I would like to thank our two panelists for being patient with me and with the questions. You have made a good contribution to this debate. We keep in touch with you, and for further interaction and questions, we are so interested in what you are doing. Thank you all. So I would like to hand back the session back to Sylvie, Chief Moderator, who will hand over to another session Chief. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Yong Ping. Thank you, Graciela. And thank you, Dong. I think that the debate was extremely useful. as an introduction to session 2, incentive for business to invest in the CUS. Why? I come back to the remark, the very important remark made by Graciela. Graciela said there are two problems. There is a world of technology and there's a world of business. And there is a world and economics. How can you make these two matters together? And the answer is, in my view, the price of carbon. Because if you want to remove, and I agree with you, Graciela, we have to start removing CO2 from the atmosphere. And it's a huge task, and it will cost a huge amount of money. But if we want to succeed, we won't succeed by investing public money. I'm sure of that. I've been finance minister, I know what it is. So if we want to succeed, we need to introduce an incentive by giving a price to carbon. And the best incentive is for those firms that emit carbon to pay permit emissions and to pay for emissions of carbon. That is extremely important. And this is, in my view, at the heart of the issue. And when I see that in China, Dong gave the figure of CCS removal of $40 per ton that's very low. It is half the price of carbon in the European Union. In the European Union, it is more than 80 euro per ton. This is a proof that through economies of scale, we could, by a price of carbon, make a tremendous change in the fight against global warming by mixing the technology, increasing, scaling up, and carbon pricing. This is the theme of session 2, and I give the floor to the moderator, will be Mr. Nirvasan Munsami, Low Carbon Program Manager at Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, who is replacing Julien Perez, Vice President, who is unavailable. Nirvasan, you have the floor.
Yeah, hi, great. Great, I hope my screen is being shared at the moment right now. Great. So my name is Nits Munsami. I'm the CCS Program Manager at OGCI. I'll be moderating today's session on the incentives for business to invest in CCS. I'll briefly introduce you to the work that OGCI is doing to help catalyze the growth of CCS hubs globally. Thereafter, Jean-Pascal from Total will focus on CCS-related business and commercial models. Then we have Lu Zhidu, who will then focus on the role of CCS in China to achieve carbon neutrality. Thereafter, we have Ian Reilly from the World Cement Association. Please save your questions till all the panelists have spoken. We have plenty of time thereafter. Great. I'll give you a brief introduction to OGCI. OGCI initially talks were held in 2014 in Davos, where the CEOs met and recognized that the oil and gas industry was perceived as part of the climate problem and not part of the solution. Currently today, OGCI members represent more than 30% of global oil and gas production and supply. OGCI is a CEO-led organization where the CEOs meet every 2 to 3 months. Our aim is to play an active role in shaping the global pathway to net zero. OGCI is structured into 6 work streams or groups of experts from the member companies who meet on a monthly basis to discuss and advance a specific agenda set by the ExCom and the CEO steering committee. We also have a climate investment arm. They have a fund of about $1 billion, and they invest in solutions to decarbonize oil and gas and hard to abate sectors like heavy industries and transportation. Recently, OGCI had refreshed its strategy into 3 different pillars. Pillar 1 is the 1 gigaton challenge. Our 12 CEOs are committed to net zero on their scope 1 and 2, and we have updated our 2025 carbon and methane intensity targets. Pillar 2 is Well, the Pillar 2 challenge is essentially a sum of Pillar 1 and 2, and it's the 4 gigaton challenge. As a leadership group, we represent 30% of the world's oil and gas production, and OGCI will work proactively with and encourage the entire industry towards net zero. The Pillar 3 challenge is a sum of all 3 pillars, and it contributes towards the 20 gigaton challenge, and we are acting to decarbonize the entire industry. We are focusing on CCS and hydrogen to achieve this. Right. If we look at the characteristics of some of our CCS hubs globally, so currently OGCI companies have publicly announced 25 different CCS hubs across the world, as illustrated on the map on your screen. OGCI facilitates and advocates for CCS hub development through coordination and engagement with key stakeholders such as government, industries, and NGOs. The CCS hub concept with industrial clusters, shared infrastructure, and storage assists in lowering the overall integrated cost of CCS projects through economies of scale. It's paramount that CCS-related laws, policies, and regulations are put in place by governments to enable the deployment of hubs. Another important aspect to enable the large-scale national deployment of CCS is well-defined business models that are supported by attractive investment frameworks. Geological storage resources, depleted oil and gas reservoirs, and saline aquifers needs to be technically assessed and evaluated with sufficient confidence to minimize storage risks developed to commercial maturity. Right. I'd now like to give you a brief overview of one of our key CCS hubs in the UK. That is our East Coast Cluster project. I'll give you a brief introduction to this hub. However, Jean-Pascal will provide you with an overview of the business and commercial models that have been applied to this hub. The East Coast Cluster is a partnership between BP, who are the operator for this project, the National Grid, Equinor, Shell, and Total. CO2 is stored from the net zero Teesside and zero carbon Humber industrial facilities. Geologically, the site has the potential to develop up to 1 billion barrels of CO2 storage. OGCI has also done a lot of work in researching where potential global hubs could be in the future. OGCI has identified 52 countries for our global hub search study. This was based on large-scale hydrocarbon production and the presence of heavy industries emitting significant quantities of CO2. Countries highlighted in blue were included in this study, and those in black have member company presence and were not included in this joint study. Licensed and public databases were used to source emitter information per industrial sector, including geophysical information to assess storage. Software density-based algorithms were used to identify industrial emitter clusters. Thereafter, storage matching algorithms assigned industrial emitter clusters to geological storage resources. An economic assessment was performed per CCS hub, providing $ per ton CCS cost in tier bands. Further, a qualitative CCS assessment was also performed that investigated policy and regulation that may support the enablement of a CCS industry and other non-quantitative factors, such as NDCs that included CCS, pilot CCS projects, and social factors such as stakeholder attitudes to CCS. Great, I'll give you a brief summary of the findings of the study. So jointly with our consultant BCG, a CCS hub assessment was done on these 52 countries. 212 full-scale hubs were identified, accounting for approximately 6 gigatons of annual CO2 emissions. These hubs were also optimized for costs, which identified minimum cost emitters. 91 preferred scale hubs were identified at a cost below $100 per ton. On the map, these hubs are identified by the green and gold dots, and this accounts for approximately 1 gigaton annual CO2 emissions. Great. Some other key work that we do at OGCI is the CCS geological storage deliverable, and this is the CO2 storage resource catalog. The SPE, or Society of Petroleum Engineers, SRMS, Storage Resource Management System, is used to classify publicly available geological storage assessments. The storage catalog is updated annually with new countries, and this is free to download from OGCI's website. The OGCI CO2 storage resource catalog has now assessed 852 CO2 storage resource sites from 30 countries against the SPE storage resource management system. Both oil and gas fields and saline aquifers are assessed. To date, a total storage resource of approximately 97 gigatons is held within defined storage projects, representing only 0.7% of the total 14 gigatons aggregated global storage resource. Of this global total, only 4.1% is classified as discovered, approximately 600 gigatons, with less than 0.002% assessed as commercial, amounting to just over 200 million tons. Right, so all of this work that I've talked about is freely available on OGCI's website. The Global Hub analysis is freely available on the website. You can freely investigate the results of this hub study. The website also includes a very, very useful CCS Hub playbook that provides non-technical learnings from OGCI member companies that will assist developers and governments in establishing their own CCS Hub. The playbook summarizes business models and policy frameworks that have been used to enable the deployment of OGCI hubs in various regions. So OGCI has also done a number of different policy studies and white paper studies. These include policy mechanism studies and the carbon storage unit, or the CSU mechanism. White paper regional studies are also available on our website. Various links to these studies are on these slides, and I will provide them to the event organizer. Right now, I would like to hand you over to our next speaker. That will be Jean-Pascal from Total. He will focus on CCS-related business and commercial models. Jean, if I could stop sharing.
Right. Good afternoon. I hope that you are seeing me. I will try to use just a few slides to help you to follow my my speech. I believe you should be able to see my my few slides in full screen. First of all, just wanted to start with Total Energy's ambition, which is really to provide carbon capture and storage for us, but for our customers as well. Because Total Energy will be part of the net zero solution for the company, but for the society as a whole by providing carbon capture as a service. We have the know-how and the infrastructure, and our goal exceeds Total Energy's direct emission, and part of the capacity that we will be developing will be dedicated to our customer. CCS hubs make CCS viable for a wide range of industries, and we aim to develop CCS hubs at target location where emissions are concentrated. Hubs reduces the needs for additional infrastructure and realize economy of scale. And for emitters, the hubs opened up CCS as a decarbonization option without them having to take responsibility for building pipelines, drilling storage well, and without long-term liability for the stored carbon dioxide. Most CCUS will be based around industrial clusters where emission sources are close together, as in the net zero T side, now called NEP, as you can see on the right-hand side of my slide. But some will be geographically scattered, collecting emission source by pipeline or ship, as in the Northern Light in Norway, the most advanced example of a distributed hub. And Aramis in the Netherlands is another one of that kind, with a multimodal terminal and transport infrastructure to offshore storage area. Those three ones are the one where Total Energies is currently involved. Now I want to dig in a little bit more in detail in the themes of this session, which is the commercial model. What commercial model will arise, and who is the best position to capture them? And I want to first look at the commercial model for emitters. Emitters are responsible for the CO2 capture, and the business model for emitters depend on them securing revenue streams to cover both their investment in capture, purification, and compression facilities, the CapEx, and the transport and storage fee they pay to the operator, the OpEx. And revenue streams can come from a variety of sources, depending on the regulatory environment and the demand for carbon dioxide and related products from end-use customer. Depending on location, emitters may be able to secure income from a multiple revenue streams. The first kind is the emission trading scheme. In compliance markets for the carbon dioxide, such as the EU emission trading scheme, the emitter realizes a value for the emission reduction represented by the carbon dioxide capture and stored from its operation. For each ton of carbon dioxide captured and sequestrated, it does not need to buy an emission allowance in the ETS. This is the first kind. Tax credit, the second kind. Some governments offer performance-based tax credits designed to incentivize carbon capture and storage or utilization. An example of this is the 45Q carbon capture tax credit in the US, where qualifying emitters can generate a federal tax liability offset per captured ton of carbon dioxide. This offset can be used directly by the emitter or traded with other organizations in any US state. The third type, the voluntary carbon markets. In the absence of a compliance market, emitters can potentially sell carbon credit in the voluntary carbon market based on a certified emission avoided or reduced through their involvement in a CCUS hub. Voluntary carbon markets are expanding rapidly, stimulated by growing corporate net zero commitments. The methodology for CCUS, however, are still evolving. Initiatives such as the CCS Plus and the ACCU are exploring transparent ways to create carbon credits and make use of Article 6 of the Paris Agreement that will regulate voluntary international trading of carbon credits. Until regulations are tightened, voluntary markets can play an important supporting role in funding CCUS. Fourth, the CO2 as a commodity. Carbon dioxide is used in several agricultural, food production, and industrial processes where it has a market value. And last, the low carbon intensity product. Emitters may be able to attract a premium from lower carbon products enabled by CCUS. Low carbon procurement is also starting to create a potential revenue stream for CCUS-enabled industrial products. That was for the emitters side. Now let's look into the business model for the transport and storage operator. The business model for transport and storage operator is relatively simple. They are paid a fee for transport and storage, the carbon dioxide emission captured by their industrial customers. The tariff is structured to cover the operator investment and operating costs and provide a return on capital employed. There are three broad types of model. The contractor to states. This model is suitable when markets and policies incentives are weak. Investment and operating costs are predominantly financed or guaranteed by the government, which contracts planning, development, and operation to state-owned or private entities. And the example of that is the Northern Light Phase 1 project. The second kind of model is the enabled market, which is a hybrid model comprised of state intervention in some parts of the market and a managed competition in other parts. The example of that kind of model is the Portos Rotterdam hub with capital funding from the EU and fees to emitters to cover the cost. Third, the liberalized market. This model is suitable where market and policies incentives are strong and private company develop and manage pipeline and storage sites without specific state direction. The example there is the US Louisiana hub, whereby the hub emerges on the back of infrastructure developed by the private sector for CCUS point-to-point projects. I will conclude in saying that transport and storage for transport and storage, actors with significant financing capacities and experience to evaluate project and investment risk will be well positioned to capture such models. And they are typically oil and gas companies having in mind the subsurface risk. Right, that's what I wanted to share with you today, and I will therefore hand the floor to my next colleagues.
Great, Jean, thank you so much. That was a very, very informative presentation. Thank you so much. So next up, we've got Lu Zhidu, who's going to focus on the role of CCS in China and achieving carbon neutrality. Lu?
Thank you very much, Nick. Also, many thanks to the forum for the invitation to me to share my observations. I just maybe share my slides. I prepare several slides for this discussion. I hope that you can see my slide.
Yes.
Okay, good, great. Maybe just a very brief introduction myself, not for promotion. I just left Asian Development Bank as the lead climate change specialist in April this year. That means just one month, a little more ago. And in ADB, I manage the CCS projects and also the carbon market project. So I will discuss something, my observation on carbon market and also to promoting CCS projects. Also, by the way, that I joined ADB in year 2010. And before I joined ADB, I worked in China in the government. I also working on CCS and carbon market. I used to be the focal point of CCS of China from 2002 until the time I left the government to join ADB. So I would share several observations. This is not representing any organization, but only my own observation on really how we can promote the CCS projects through carbon market, or if we would go. To let us first see what would be the challenge for the CCS development. I think I guess I don't need to talk a lot because several colleagues have discussed this issue already. But just maybe just highlight this main challenge is the high cost. I think this is the say we have many challenge for scale up CCS investment, but the high cost is the fundamental or most important challenge. So now what the message I got is about $80 per ton. This investment and operation in China. Now, just Mr. Shidong say maybe it can lower down to 40 or even lower than that. I think that's good sign. But I'm not really sure if that would be the for all projects or only for some projects. But I think worldwide this is a bigger challenge, high cost. Number one. Number two. Now all this operation of these CCS projects, ongoing projects, all those that on pipeline, mainly they will rely on government subsidies or some maybe the fundings for other channels. So there's no good normal business model, therefore to operate CCS projects. So this is another issue. And then many studies shows that in the case of China, that the government announced that the country will achieve carbon neutrality by 2060. Then estimation is that they will need about more than 1 gigaton carbon dioxide annually from until that time. So of course, there's different numbers by different studies, but I think it is quite certain that this will be a big number. So some estimates maybe 1.5 gigaton or 2 gigatons or and so on. So this is the observation on this CCS development in China. Now, my next observation for these issues for CCS to be included in carbon market emission trading scheme. Actually, there are a huge amount of issues or barriers that to include a CCS in national emission trading. Now, China national emission trading launched last year, and it established these power generation plants. And for CCS, obviously that we see that there's no legal and policy framework that can guide the CCS projects for emission trading. We don't have these sound acceptable methodology how to count the emission reductions from CCS projects. Even though there are a lot of discussion, there are a lot of study, we can also see some study quite good. But if we want to take it as this say acceptable methodology and also less public concern on it, I say we still have a lot of work to do. In particular, on those permanence of this storage underground of carbon dioxide, just for example. And then also we can still see a lot of public concern on this storage and so on carbon dioxide. So without solving all this issue, then this it will really take some time to include these CCS projects in the national carbon market. Yeah. So as I said at the previous slides, it may take long time to address those policies. So, but it is quite urgent, not only for China but world, that to scale up CCS projects, so that then we can learn, we can develop this technology. We can also largely lower down this investment operational cost. What do we can do? So this is several this observation for the solutions. Number one, I think we still need to work with government to address those policy, methodology, and environment concern, so that we can have policy in place to guide this development. We can have sound methodology that can calculate, that can ensure that we can have accurate calculation of emission reductions by such kind of CCS projects. So we need this one that we need to continue. Second, just some thinking. If we would say encourage that by doing something like an issue limited the CCS carbon credits, or for future carbon CCS carbon credit, or some discount the CCS credit, something like that, that to incentivize, to encourage CCS development. Actually, this would be something that to draw this public budget, public money, that to provide incentives for those companies that to invest in CCS project, so that we can scale up now, and then to say to have this learning curve done quickly. So this is something, some idea. I hope that this will be really innovative idea. Then we can say we can practice if this would work. This is something like this learning cost, public learning cost. Number two, this is mainly for carbon market. Number three, I think we still need the government subsidy. Otherwise, it will be really very difficult that to move ahead this CCS investment. And then number four, additional other policies measures maybe that that can be explored. Something like that. Those facilities with CCS, they can be provided more other business opportunities. For instance, I think in case of China, this is quite workable, and maybe also can we say establish some special funds to mobilize from those fossil fuel consumption, any certain amount of fossil fuel consumption that they from those consumption that we can levy some funds, some money that to establish some special fund for CCS development, something like that, and so on. I think I believe there will be a lot of means that we can mobilize. We can mobilize some money as to establish a special fund for CCS development, as long as we would like to do so. So this is some observation for future solutions. That is for the case of China. But I believe that also for many other countries, this may also work. So I just want to highlight these points, and I will be very happy to discuss with colleagues, so also with audience. This is my content, and I will be very happy to discuss maybe offline through other channel. Thank you very much.
Lou, thank you so much. It's really exciting to hear that China may be able to abate up to 1 gigaton CO2 by CCS by 2060, even as high as 2 gigatons, as you mentioned, which is really assuring. Thank you. Thanks, Lou. Thanks for that. Great. Next up, we've got Ian Reilly from the World Cement Association. Over to you, Ian.
So thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. I'm going to take a slightly different approach here and not talk too much about CCU and CCS, except as a customer. So just to set the scene, the cement industry is responsible for about 7 or 8% of greenhouse gas emissions globally. And about 60% of those emissions are process emissions that come from the decomposition of limestone in the kiln. So with the current production methodology, we don't know how to avoid that. So the things that are more rapidly decarbonizing, such as electrical power or transportation, represent a very small part of the overall emissions. So we're classified as a hard to abate industry. And in all of the roadmaps that we have, and we have many roadmaps in different countries and with different organizations around the world, in all of those roadmaps, CCUS plays a large part, accounting for the majority of the abatement of that 60% of process emissions at least. And the cement industry is also very carbon intensive from the revenue generated per ton of CO2. So we're very sensitive to the price of carbon. In cement, we have a revenue of around about 100, perhaps 150 US dollars a ton per ton of emission. And if you compare that with steel, steel's probably about 400. So you can see it's a very carbon intensive from a commercial standpoint as well. So the two methods that we can look at to abate particularly the process emissions are CCS and CCU. And as many of the speakers today have said, the issue with CCS is, of course, cost, and I guess also location. Clearly, if you're on a suitable geological strata, or if you're next to one of the hubs, then your costs are going to be lower than if you're not. The issue with CCU is that many of the technologies are very early stage, and CCU in our context is really about carbonation of concrete, or of particularly the sort of unused cement that you find in concrete. And this means that you have quite a complex commercial challenge to make this work, because you have waste supplies or construction demolition supplies that you have to bring in order to do the CCU, use the CCU process to absorb the CO2, and then you have a large quantity of product as well. So it's not as simple as a CCS from a commercial standpoint. It's quite complicated to make it work. Another issue with this is that not all of the CCU methodologies will give you credits in the ETS. So if you store it under the North Sea, it'll give you credits, but if you store it in a cementitious product like fly ash, you probably won't get credits for that. So here we have some of the lower cost opportunities to reduce or to absorb CO2 that are not necessarily incorporated into the ETS yet. And I guess this will change over time, but certainly this is a challenge for companies that want to use CCU technologies to decarbonize. So I think, I certainly agree with what Edmund said at the beginning of this, that the drivers for reduction will be the CO2 price. And I think another one is also in procurement, so the market preferences. Government procurement can play a big role. Governments around the world buy about half of cement and concrete. So government preferences can make a big difference. And of course, governments also make a big difference in terms of regulations, and indeed in terms of product standards. So again, standards can get in the way of innovation and opportunities to reduce CO2 emissions. Of course, we don't want to have bridges falling down, so I'm not suggesting that standards are not important, but I think we should be looking carefully at whether it's possible to accelerate the pace at which standards can be safely changed. So one other thought, at Glasgow, we heard quite a lot about climate justice. Of course, not a new topic, but one that we heard more about. I'm sure in Sharm el-Sheikh this year, we're going to hear a great deal more. And so finding a mechanism for developed countries to support the decarbonization in developing countries, I think is very critical. Cement is, 90% of cement is produced in developing countries. So this is a very important factor for the industry. And I guess we can look back at some of the mechanisms that were used, 10 years or so ago with the CDM. Of course, some of those were, discredited, or at least partially discredited, because they weren't necessarily projects that yielded additionality, that there was some perhaps creative accounting. And of course, the other thing that I think is important is that the CDM mechanism, as it was applied before, tended to favor particular types of projects. And if you really had an innovative approach, it probably wouldn't qualify. So I think this, whether we talk about a CDM type of mechanism or the ETS qualification, one of the challenges is to get the system to keep up to date with potential innovations. Otherwise, we'll miss out on some of the lower cost ways of reducing our carbon emissions. So I think, just to summarize, I think CCS is something that we're probably going to see developing at scale, and more quickly than CCU, but I think I'd hope that we don't forget about CCU, which may indeed turn out to be a lower cost, albeit perhaps something that takes a longer time to implement. So thank you.
Great. Thanks, Ian. I think we're going to move into questions right now. So I'm going to maybe kick it off. We'll kick off the questions really quickly. So the last time I looked into the cement sector, 30% of overall CO2 emissions from cement may be able to be abated by CCS or utilization, as you mentioned. So how is the cement sector going to embark on this challenge? What are your next steps to achieve this? Maybe let's look at a more simple model like geological storage. You would need to ramp up pretty quickly to start achieving 2030 targets. So what are your immediate next steps to try and do this?
So I think it comes down to incentives, and if you have cement prices typically on an ex-works basis something like 70 to 100 US dollars a ton, depending on where you are in the world, and a ton of cement has about 600 or 700 kilos of CO2 emissions. So you can see that if we're talking about even $100 a ton for CCS, then this is something that's going to double the price of the product. So that's not going to happen unless there are incentives in place, and those incentives are either going to be regulation or else it's carbon pricing. And without significant carbon pricing, we won't see very rapid changes. So at the carbon pricing level we currently have in Europe or in the UK of something around 80 euros, or I think at the moment it's even more than that in the UK, then that starts to it doesn't give enough to justify a CCS project today, but it might give enough to start a CCS project because your expectation is that it's going to be higher in the years to follow. So I think that's the mechanism. If government doesn't set up incentives, as has been done in Europe to some extent, then I think we will not see rapid progress.
Great, Ian. Thank you. Very, very interesting response. There's also quite a lot of work on OGCI that we have done on the carbon storage units, which you can look at as well. It is another mechanism to try and incentivize storage, but it's more a penalty system whereby the customer has got to pay for it. Though I will leave the floor open to questions. So please raise your hand. Yuho, I do see Yuho's hand up. Yuho, please go ahead. Hi, Yuho. Good afternoon.
Hello, Nits, and thanks for the talks. I would like to ask Ian, what do you think is the role and impact that public procurement rules could have? Because you mentioned that half of the cement in the world is bought by public entities, cities or governments, or maybe not governments, but public entities of some sort. And do you think that there could be a role for procurement to really boost clean or CCUS cement even in some countries?
Yeah, I think there is a tremendous opportunity there. We can look at what's happened in the UK since it's become a legal commitment to reach net zero carbon in 2050. And then that's been incorporated into the requirement for infrastructure projects. And so for example, the HS2 or national roads and so forth, these projects now are all talking to their contractors about how they're going to achieve lower carbon solutions. And the contractors then are looking for ways to do that. And what we see, which is I think interesting and indeed very dangerous for the cement industry, is that the contractors themselves, if they're not able to satisfy the requirements that they have with the traditional material suppliers, are looking at what they can do themselves to get involved in this. And there's an example with HS2 in London of the contractor there, which is a Skanska-led consortium, looking at whether they could calcine the clays that they're digging out of the tunnels that they're digging and the cuttings that they're digging, and use that as a cementitious material. I mean, it's a really terrible cementitious material, but they're still willing to make to try to make it work in some of the less critical applications. So I do think that's a direct result of the government saying you have to plan to get to net zero, and all of these infrastructure projects have got to look at this question. We also see going along with that, and I think this is maybe even more interesting in some ways, a drive towards circularity, so reusing the materials. So if we're not circular in the construction industry, then we're really not circular, because construction, as you probably know, uses probably half or thereabouts of the total materials. Concrete is the most used material in the world after water. So I think that the government and public procurement policy can have a very big impact. And it has an impact also in changing product standards and construction standards to allow some of these innovations to be used. So if you have some very innovative material, you're probably not going to meet historical standards. And in the past, it's taken a very long time to change standards. So that really slows down progress. I think so government getting involved in procurement and in setting standards is extremely helpful.
Great, thanks, Iho. That was a great suggestion on public procurement. Next, we've got a question from Franz. Franz, over to you.
Yes, my question is, if you change relative prices and cement becomes more expensive or less used because of public procurement, for example, we see a lot of replacement by cement, by wood, so less intensive CO2 materials. Do you see this as a sort of development which we could see?
Yes, I think that's likely to play a role. So we can see advances in the way that timber is used. And obviously, timber is a bit of a complicated product in terms of its carbon footprint, but generally it's a good thing, I think we could say, even despite the complexities. When you look at infrastructure, though, you don't really see timber as an alternative. We're not going to start using timber to hold up the tunnels for our underground systems and this sort of thing. So I think there's a segment of the market where we will see timber in particular, and perhaps other things replacing concrete, let me say, rather than cement. But I also think what we'll see is innovation in the way in which concrete is made, so that not all concrete is using cement, at least to the current extent. There are a lot of materials that you can use to substitute for cement. Now, you might not want to do that if you're building a bridge or a high rise, but for a lot of applications where the risk of failure is much less catastrophic, I do think we'll see either zero cement or low cement concretes being used.
Right. Thanks, Franz. Next up, we've got a question from Stephanie.
You can hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. So my question relates to, just a second.
You're on mute right now.
Right?
Yep, you're back on, yeah.
How about now?
Yep, you're on.
Okay, sorry, because I've actually joined with two devices. I apologize. My question relates to potential for international cooperation. Also, this is also a question to Zewde and relates to what Ian was saying. I don't know if I understood you correctly, Ian, that 90% of cement is produced in the developing world. And a lot of the discussions that we're having here about policies and technologies are still primarily happening in the developed world. I mean, of course, we've seen developments in China, but what do panelists see as the roadmap for development and deployment of CCS and CCU technologies in the developing part of the world?
Sure. Do you want to go for that first?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Stephanie, for that question. I think that's really very important issue for this CCS development roadmap. I think in the case, I was talking about China. So maybe may I answer that related to the case of China. China has, as far as I know, that has developed the CCS development roadmap by themselves, and then they updated, I guess, for 2 times already. And the latest updated information, I guess that that was published by the government, the Ministry of Science and Technology. Actually, that was the agency that I used to serve back to 2010 for about 20 years. I think they have very clear message on how to develop this in terms of the technology and also how to scale up step by step. And I guess they will focus more on the technology development, and then based on that, also through this the deployment of the technology, and then also this carbon market and other subsidies also were part of those factors that to affect this. I don't think I can highlight all of those, but number one, I just want to highlight that the government has developed this, and then also number two, if I may share my own observation on this, I believe that this technology and also business will develop gradually, but not very quickly from my observation, from now until 2030. It will steadily move ahead for the development, but I think this will highly rely on how much subsidy the government can provide, and also this say public can accept. And also, I believe that this carbon market will still not be able to play a very key role in this process. And then after 2030, no matter technology itself, and also this deployment will go much faster than before 2030. I guess this is related to the technology material, or this is something this technology learning curve. I guess at the time the cost will also go down gradually. So, but I don't think we can expect that this if without subsidy, without carbon market incentives, without I don't think we can expect large commercial operation, because if without any of those incentives, just now as I highlight, no matter it's other good opportunities, sometimes they can provide more business opportunities. Just for the case of China, if those power generation by coal can operate, say 6,000 hours a year, they can make more money, and they can use the additional money to offset or to compensate this CCS cost compared to those much shorter, maybe only 4,000 hours a year, just as kind of example. So incentives, if say we have enough incentives, then this development will be quick. Without that, if you still go ahead, but very slow. And then, but after 2030 or 2040, then it will go much faster. That's my estimate. Thank you.
Sorry, I don't know if you'd like me to add something to that. I worked in China for 20 years, and so mostly in the cement industry. And the way that China deals with these issues is quite different from a Western approach. We've seen that already with a whole series of technologies, not CO2 per se, but recently China has adopted some new energy standards for the cement industry. And of course, that's not addressing the process emissions, but it's addressing the fuel emissions. And these are really pushing the cement companies to use the best technology available. So if you compare the situation in China and the situation in Europe, the European plants are much, much less efficient than the Chinese plants because they haven't had to upgrade in the same way that the Chinese plants have over the last 10 or 20 years. Plus, the Chinese plants are anyway newer on average. But I think the situation in China is rather unique. And if we were to look at the second largest cement producer, which is India, then the likely solutions in India are going to be quite different from China from a policy perspective, and maybe a little bit more similar to what has worked in Europe. So I think it will be different approaches in different countries.
All right, thanks, Ian. I see there's no more questions, and we have reached the end of our time. So Jean-Pascal, Lou, Ian, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. I'd like to now hand over back to Edmund.
Thank you, Nirvasan. Excellent moderation, and thank you to Jean-Pascal, Theodore, and Jan for their excellent presentations and for the discussion, which was very useful. Now we come to the last session, which will focus on the regulatory environment. And by the way, it is very well introduced by the previous sessions. So I give the floor to Dan McDougall. And I thank Dan for being with us. He's following the work we are doing at the task force. He has been following it since the beginning. He's a senior fellow at the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, which is doing a very, very important and useful job because it is promoting something which, in my view, is extremely interesting for the future to fight global warming. It is a Montreal Protocol. Because putting in place the Montreal Protocol more than 30 years ago allowed us to get rid, to save the ozone layer through an agreement with many thousands and thousands of firms all around the world. So, Dan, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Edmond, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody. And thank you, Edmond, for organizing this event. It's been quite fascinating to follow thus far. So maybe just a little bit of a recap. We've heard, really the importance, the criticality of CCUS and its deployment, including how the modeling that's been done that looks at how we get to a sustainable path to net zero has very, very significant, up to 15% amounts of CO2 being used or sequestered in one way or another. And we've also seen, the kind of the state of play for how this is happening, which is again quite interesting. We see kind of a not much more than a steady state thus far in terms of the actual operational plans for CCUS around the globe. There's a lot of plans, a lot of activity in the planning stage and in the early stages of development. The next sessions, look just now at what business can do and what business is doing, both from making the case for CCUS and actually working to advance it. And as I was listening to that and thinking of this session, there's a significant degree of commonality or overlap between what business is doing and what they're saying government needs to do. So this session now is really looking at the kind of the government side of things, the regulatory environment. We've heard a lot about the policy and regulatory environment. So as we say regulatory, it's entre guillemets, in quotes, we're looking at regulations widely, including the pricing regimes, but also, incentives more generally, be they, positive incentives, as we've see with subsidies, and we hear talk about subsidies, but also, if you will, negative incentives, where putting a price on something we don't want, emissions to the atmosphere, is part of the regime. So that's what we're going to look at now, including, the notion, and I hope our panelists will perhaps pick up on this, and it goes to your point on the global nature of this, and how do we get around the necessity of governments acting perhaps more collectively in this, and avoiding the problem of after you, and not wanting to put their industries at any sort of a disadvantage from a government policy perspective. Are there things that we can be looking at that will, again, perhaps on a sectoral basis, look to take away those disincentives that's in the public policy sphere as well. So we have a number of speakers who are going to look at these and other topics, from intergovernmental organizations and from government organizations. And we'll hear from Edmond more directly on his thoughts and ideas on how to advance this work as well. So our first speaker is Juho Lupanen, who's the coordinator of CCUS initiative at the Clean Energy Ministerial, one of those intergovernmental forums that's really doing yeoman's work to advance dealing with the climate issue from an energy perspective. You have the floor, please.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I think it's a very, very good introduction to what we're probably going to hear during this session. And many thanks to Edmond and your colleagues for the invitation to this really interesting event. I have a couple of pictures to show, not very many, but it's just to frame some of these thoughts on CCUS regulation and the regulatory framework. That is indeed, as Daniel, you said, the government sphere of things. The Clean Energy Ministerial, very briefly, is a group of around 30 governments these days that come together voluntarily to accelerate development of clean energy technologies. And under this group of 30 governments, there are over 20 different work streams where governments work together on different technology or horizontal topics. One of them is the CCUS initiative. We're in existence since 2018. You see on the left-hand side the countries. I'm not going to read the country names to you, but I think you can get a glimpse there of who is involved and the type of, I would say, mostly leader countries and a few followers who have joined together in this initiative, essentially to learn from each other, to learn from each other's experience on how you make policy to deploy carbon capture. We don't really work that much on the research side of things. This is really mostly about the deployment policies. And on the right-hand side, you will see some of the other connections that we have to industry, different industry associations and banks and other groups, some of which have already spoken today. Now, I only have one content slide really on the regulatory aspects, which I hope will show you the sort of broad spectrum of what governments need to think of when regulating CCUS. So objectives and some key issues. I think often when you speak with people about CCUS or carbon capture regulation, there's at least two things that come to the fore. One is laws and regulations needed to enable carbon capture projects. Various things underneath this, but it is to make them possible, to make them go forward. And the second obvious area that is often discussed is to ensure the safety and environmental integrity of these operations so that we do them safely and that they actually do the job they're intended to do, i.e. to permanently sequester CO2 from the atmosphere. But in addition to these, I think there's also a third area, which is to use government policy and regulation to steer the overall CCUS ecosystem development. I mean, this is still a nascent industry in many areas, and governments have a lot to do as regards how and in what form you drive this forward in your country. A few points under each of these headlines. Enabling carbon capture projects first. A key element there is CO2 capture and storage legal in your country? Less of an issue with capture, but storage definitely. There have been countries in this world that have actually banned the injection of CO2 underground. Some have taken and come back and made a 180-degree turn and made it legal again. So there's I would say, a basic issue there that governments need to look at. Secondly, actually points B and C and the rest here are aspects that have already been mentioned in the program today, which is providing incentives for these projects, whether they are fiscal incentives that were already mentioned in the, for example, United States style, direct subsidies or direct support mechanisms. I think Jean-Pascal and Sjödu outlined a few interesting mechanisms in the previous talks, and all the way on to carbon markets, which are obviously the end game and have to be the end game in this. I don't think we can think of directly subsidizing carbon capture for many generations of technology. It needs to be something that fits with a carbon price mechanism. We just mentioned public procurement rules and standards, which is basically to enforce the purchase of some sort of clean product that has been produced with new technologies, including CCUS. So another mechanism there that governments are considering. And then I think the new area that has come to the fore very much in the past few years is this finance-related rules that can boost clean energy. These are the taxonomies. These are the ESG rules and reporting that that companies are doing, in some cases, I think voluntarily, in some cases, more or less forced to do that. But the finance-related rules actually are becoming more and more important in this area and can certainly help, also the case for carbon capture. Now, ensuring safety and integrity, I will there. Another area where governments are active. Under capture, we have obviously the various environmental reviews and permits that need to be in place, the systems to get those permits. But much less of an issue for capture than for transport and storage. Again, in transport, if we have transport systems, pipeline, ship, rail systems, we need to have requirements for their safe operation, their safe build out, and so forth. And the key area is obviously the long-term storing of CO2, and that we have mechanisms in place to ensure that the storing of CO2 happens safely and leads to permanent storage in the long term, and that stewardship of the CO2 that has to stay underground for hundreds and thousands of years. And a number of countries have put laws and regulations in place in this area. We have the EU directive, we have several US states, provinces in Canada, Australia, who actually have regulatory frameworks in place to ensure safe and permanent storage of CO2. And so there's a lot of examples out there already for countries to take a look at when they start to put these systems in place. And finally, under the third area, steering the overall ecosystem development. We have heard about hubs and infrastructure already today. I think the paradigm of creating hubs, strategic hubs where you can use common infrastructure is a key thing, and where government policy can help us drive towards that direction. Especially the case with CCU and carbon removals is the area of life cycle analysis, the monitoring and verification in that area. I think it's less of an issue for sort of plain vanilla direct CO2 capture and storage, but definitely relevant for CCU and carbon removals. Strategies for those early mover projects probably require something specific from each government, specific programs, specific support mechanisms, as opposed to the standard ones that we hopefully then have in place for a lot of different projects. And finally, governments have a strong role in the international collaboration. Research is one of them. We can really, by sharing information here, avoid duplicating research and build on other people's research, other countries' research. But then other also legal aspects, like, for example, cross-border transport of CO2 under the London Protocol, for example, which has certain legal and regulatory issues that need to be solved by governments. So it's a very broad field, and answers to many of these already exist. Good practice already exists. It's not uniform, and I think one of the key objectives that our group is actually to share best practice on all of these. I'll end there. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Juho. You've packed a lot into a couple of slides, and a very good overview of the realities and necessity of the regulatory environment writ large. And hopefully we'll come back and perhaps unpack a few of those points as we get to the question and answer session. Next up, we have Stephanie Lohay-Toué, who's the Senior Project Manager at the International Carbon Action Partnership. Stephanie, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you. Hello, everyone. I hope you can see my screen. My name is Stephanie, and I'd like to also introduce briefly ICAP. The International Carbon Action Partnership is a small international organization with 40 jurisdictions that works on the design and implementation of emission trading systems. And we've been doing a fair amount of work on removals and recently also on CCUS, which is what I'd like to talk to you about today. So the first thing is, do emission trading systems matter? I mean, Ian already spoke about this, Jean also before, and what is the landscape there, right? So we have right now 25 emission trading systems in force, 7 under development, so they're already in law and being developed, and 15 more under consideration. They're less and more encouraging numbers. Currently, they only cover 17% of global GHG emissions, but they cover around 1/3 of the global population, 54% of net zero targets and pledges, and 55% of global GDP. And importantly, they've also generated $161 billion in revenues since 2008. So from the point of view of thinking about policy instruments that could contribute to CCS and CCU development and deployment, ETSs can matter a lot. So we've been looking, as I mentioned, on the interactions between ETSs and removals. So if we start by thinking removals happening outside the boundary of emitters covered by the ETS. So we have a paper called Emission Trading Systems and Net Zero Trading Removals. And we've looked into a few questions here. What role could ETSs play in incentivizing removals? What role could these removals play in emission trading systems? And what are the risks and opportunities of different models of interaction? And we have mapped out 4 different models of interaction, all the way from the market for allowances. So the ETS and the market for removals are completely disconnected. What are the pros and cons there? All the way to ETSs and removals are completely connected. They're part of the same market. And what are the pros and cons there? And some of the criteria that we look at are how much of an incentive can the ETS provide to removal technologies, also taking into account the price differentials across removal technologies. How does this impact the economics inside of the ETS? Including removals in the ETS provides a means to reduce or to offset residual emissions as but on the other hand, it could be very, very cheap in the future and therefore engage in less abatement behavior in the short term. I hope you can still hear me. I've seen that my internet connection is unstable. I hope it still works out. So these are some of the things that we've looked at. There is a paper out there. You can follow this link and hopefully it's going to be useful. Now, when it comes to emission trading systems and CCUS, so here we start looking at mitigation happening not outside the boundary, as in the case of removals, but inside the boundary of emitters covered by the ETS. And this is the paper that I'm currently working on, which will look at precisely this issue. So the questions we're looking at are, how do current emission trading systems incorporate CCUS provisions? So we've surveyed all 40 of our member jurisdictions and we've asked them these questions, and we're going pretty deep into their regulation to understand if and how they consider CCUS. If emission trading systems were to include CCUS provisions, what elements need to be addressed? So the paper will hopefully provide good reflections on what are the common pitfalls, what are the main areas for regulation, what are the common pitfalls, some of the good solutions that have been found out there. Although I should add that we don't have terribly many precedents. So this is also an area of active development. And finally, what role could emission trading systems play in incentivizing CCUS development and deployment, and are there disadvantages to doing so? So we're very early in the process of this paper. We're really mostly in the data gathering phase right now. And so it's been quite interesting to be part of this event, and any comments or questions that you have are mostly welcomed. So to finish off with a very quick example of an interaction between an emission trading system and CCUS, we can look at the EU ETS. So the CCS directive establishes the legal framework for CO2 storage under the EU ETS, and it provides a financial incentive for CCS. So there is no obligation to surrender allowances when emissions are stored in a valid storage site. Importantly, the emissions throughout the CCS process are also covered. So any leakage that you have during capture, transportation, or storage would entail A, monitoring, and B, the surrendering of an allowance should a leakage occur. Now, the treatment of CCS and CCU is quite different in the EU ETS, and CCU does not typically reduce surrender obligations. And I say typically because there was an ECJ, a European Court of Justice ruling in 2017 that ruled in favor of reduced surrender obligations in the case of precipitated calcium carbonate production. Please don't ask me about this, but I can tell you there was an ECJ ruling on this, and this is one of the elements that is being looked at in the EU ETS directive revision process. Now, the biomass emissions factor is 0, which means that under the EU ETS right now, there is no incentive for bioenergy and CCS. And this is one of the elements where in the paper, we're also hoping to explore a little bit more. And there's also no incentive for direct air capture and CCS. So the EU ETS, as it is conceptualized today, it is dealing with emissions that go into the atmosphere as opposed to concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere. So it cannot really, as is, contemplate removals. And there's also no provision for offsets, which limits the leeway to include things such as DACs right now. And finally, CCS and CCU are eligible for support under the Innovation Fund, which can and does provide a lot of support for policy and technology development. So this is it from my side. Many thanks, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. A ton of useful information there, and further homework for policy wonks to delve deeper into your current paper that you referenced and the upcoming paper that you've got going on. Next up as a panelist, we have David Boublil, who's the deputy head of the unit on indirect taxation and tax administration for the European Commission. David, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much. In this session and in previous sessions, carbon pricing has been mentioned a lot. The EU ETS has just been mentioned and described how it works with carbon capture and storage, and I think it is time now to mention one element, which is still a proposal, which is not yet legislation, but which is there to complement and reinforce the EU main carbon pricing instrument on industrial emissions, the EU ETS. That's the proposal for a carbon border adjustment mechanism. So the link to carbon capture is through the ETS, but I'll come to that. Well, the carbon border adjustment is an instrument that the Commission has proposed to complement the ETS in order to address the risk of carbon leakage as the EU raises its climate ambition and raises the constraints it puts on the ambition to reduce emissions. As we do that, and as we do that by reinforcing carbon price, there is an increased risk of carbon leakage. And CBAM would be there to address this risk as an alternative to the current mechanism that we have to address the risk of the carbon leakage, essentially the free allocation under the ETS, which have an impact on the carbon price and the efficiency, and I'll come to that also in relation to CCS. How do we address the risk of carbon leakage? Well, CBAM is a measure that looks at the actual emission, the actual declared emission of imported goods, and tries to and will apply a carbon price similar to the carbon price that would have been paid in the context of the ETS if the products had been produced in the EU. It mirrors the functioning of the EU ETS. It is designed to work in an international environment, meaning that it is designed to comply with WTO rules and other commitments of the EU. And it is a targeted measure. I mentioned the EU ETS, so we're looking only at industrial emissions. And within the EU ETS, we have targeted a few sectors which are the most emitters. We're looking into steel, cement, electricity, aluminium, and fertilizers, which altogether represent about half of the emissions that are covered by the ETS. As I was saying, it is something that is designed to work in an international context. So the CBAM is based on an actual emission methodology. It will be assessed on the declared actual emissions, net emissions, meaning that if there is capture, they will be treated as under the ETS, meaning that captured emissions are considered not emitted, not released. So not subject to pricing. Well, the EU ETS extend a bit beyond the EU, so countries that apply the EU ETS outside or that have an ETS linked to the EU will not be subject to CBAM. If a carbon price is paid outside the EU, it will come in deduction of the adjustment to be paid when goods are imported in the EU. There is the possibility to conclude agreement to facilitate compliance and how to take into account this carbon price. And there are special rules for import of electricity from countries with an electricity grid coupled with the EU. I think it was important to indicate the scope of emissions that are covered by the EU ETS. Well, the idea is to have the same, by CBAM, The idea is to have the same scope as what would have been subject to the ETS if produced in the EU. ETS applies to installations, CBAM applies to goods. So we need to have an approach to translate what happened at the different steps of production and to look at goods as if they had been produced in the EU. So we are essentially looking at scope 1 emissions that are generated from the production, but we also need to look at the emission of some input materials. And the idea is when it will be possible to include also indirect emissions of electricity. Well, this was just to explain that CBAM is applied on the emissions as declared and as calculated, taking into account a number of elements, but we're talking about net emissions. So if part of the emissions are captured in the process of production, well, this should not give rise to a CBAM when the goods are imported in the EU. Just to say, I said in introduction that it was a project. The Commission proposed its CBAM regulation on 14th of July last year. It has led to an agreement in the Council of the European Union on the 15th of March. There will be a vote in the European Parliament next week, which could allow us to conclude the legislative process later this year, maybe before the end of the year. But that will not be entirely it, because there's also a set of secondary legislation to be adopted, including the one that will define in detail how the emissions embedded in the goods would be reported. And when, of course, this is the piece of secondary legislation that will set out in detail the how capture will be treated in CBAM. But there's one rule in CBAM, it's that it mirrors the ETS. So what happens in the ETS should happen in CBAM. So this implementing act that will define the reporting of embedded emissions will replicate this idea that when the emissions are captured in the production process, they are considered not released. Yes, and so that's how CBAM extends some of the principles presented by Stephanie previously when mentioning the EU ETS to goods imported in the EU, with the idea of providing the same incentives for such goods. Another element that I was saying at the beginning is that CBAM, as we introduce CBAM, we will progressively remove free allocation, meaning that the carbon price will have to be paid on all emissions in the EU, not only part of the emissions. And that should also be an incentive to remove more emission, well, to capture more of the emissions to avoid this carbon price. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. Great job, I must say, on explaining a very complex set of interactions between the EU ETS, CBAM, and CCUS, and how those can effectively interact.
Yes, I just realized that I had slides. I was thinking that I was presenting them, but I realized that I did not. I'm sorry about that, but I can send them if people are interested.
I'm sure people will be interested, but I can tell you that your words did an effective job in making those connections. So interesting. Your title is head of indirect taxation. It's interesting to see how that indirect mechanism really works, and actually becomes something quite direct as you get to the implementation of these actions. Edmond, I believe you're up next, and perhaps you might, I suspect, take a little bit of a slightly different tack from David's, and maybe look at something a little bit more direct in terms of a model for taxation.
Okay.
And you have the floor.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you. During my 6 minutes, let me raise 6 points, which are takeaways from the current discussion, which will lead me to the so-called, what I call the industrial sectoral approach. First, with CO2 in the atmosphere still increasing every year, reversing the trend requires global ambition, vision, and leadership, because we have to face short-run as well as long-run challenges. With the energy crisis pushing production of energy from fossil fuel upwards, as we see today, carbon emissions are rising. And in the longer run, emerging markets need more energy for development and for raising their populations' living standard. And we need to take into account, as Graciela reminded us, the huge amount of carbon in the atmosphere which has to be removed, and we have to start urgently. Second point, if we want to succeed, we have to address this issue through the firms that emit carbon, not only those who use fossil fuels to produce electricity, but also those in industrial sectors which are still emitting a significant amount of carbon, such as steel, cement, fertilizers, petrochemicals, and so on. These firms will enable over time, and that is very important, to take the necessary steps to dramatically reduce their emissions. It is an imperious necessity to abide by the 1.5 degrees increase in temperature. Pressure on them is still there, but we won't succeed without creating the conditions under which they will accelerate their phasing out of carbon emissions. Point 3, is reversing the trend of carbon emissions feasible? The answer is, in my view, yes, but. Yes, because some regions in the world already succeeded, the most efficient tool being the price of carbon. Look at the European Union, where the price of carbon in the ETS market is currently above 80 euro per ton. And this has helped shift from fossil fuel to renewables and even nuclear, which is coming back in Europe. There is never the but, because as I already pointed out with the energy crisis, this move toward renewables and nuclear need a long maturing phase. In the short run, it is far from being enough to compensate the increase in carbon emissions. Fourth point, reversing the trend of carbon emission is feasible under 2 conditions. The first is awareness of the dangers ahead, and it's a prerequisite. Great progress has been made in the Paris COP21, not only by people suffering from or afraid of the havoc caused by global warming, but also by the business community, which endeavors toward the energy transition should not be underestimated. There is still a challenge to convince everyone that energy transition will have a significant cost. Second condition for success, the existence of a compass. But don't we really already have it? The Montreal Protocol to phase out ozone-depleting substances has been ratified by the 197 countries belonging to the United Nations, involving thousands of firms all around the world. It saved the ozone layer in the Antarctic. In 2016, the Kigali Amendment extended the protocol to refrigerants, which is a potent greenhouse gases damaging climate. But these major achievements required decades. And to decarbonize the planet, time is of the essence. Accelerating the movement can not only be obtained through strong incentive for firms to be restructured or to make the necessary investment to capture, utilize, and store carbon they cannot avoid emitting. And this leads to my 5th point, on the industrial sectoral approach. The Montreal Protocol shows that the business community is ready to act very efficiently and swiftly. But we need clear objectives and level playing fields in order to avoid unfair competition and to put in place the right environment to face the huge cost they will incur. A sectoral price of carbon implemented with the firms concerned in order to take care of this sector's idiosyncrasies could have two strong effects. First, leading them to retrofit their plants for avoiding cost of carbon emissions, and second, help them accelerate the investment using at least parts of the proceeds. And my sixth point is about the regulatory environment. A political impulse is necessary to put in place such an ambitious framework. Implementation of the European Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism as of 2026 will be a strong incentive to go in this direction. But I do think that a global impulse could come from the three main emitters, the US, China, and the EU. Reversing the trend of carbon emissions through this sectoral approach, we need to act step by step and shows its feasibilities, starting with the sector, in my view, the easiest, which is oil and gas for its emissions of methane, a very powerful pollutant. And this will be the theme of one of our next events. And I am glad that there will be an event tomorrow on this issue with you, Dan. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Edmond, and thank you very much for pointing out a practical approach for moving forward as we look at perhaps sectoral actions to address the emissions with CCUS. I believe we have a little bit of time left, about 5-6 minutes or so for
15 minutes.
Okay, 15 minutes. Great. Okay. I open the floor to two questioners. Here, yes, please.
Yes. Did the European Commission have talks with the World Trade Organization about the issue of the equalization mechanism? It can be viewed, and that's the reality, I think, as a level playing field instrument. But it is also viewed by others as a protectionist method. And it is very important that we should get the agreement of the WTO. So how is the state of the question on this issue?
Of course, as I was saying in my presentation, making sure that the carbon border adjustment mechanism is WTO compatible was a very important element for the Commission. We have put our best experts on the subject to make sure that it would be, and we are confident that what we have proposed is compatible with WTO rules. Since we made it, I have had the opportunity to present and defend the carbon border adjustment in several WTO committees, the Committee in Trade in Goods, the Committee in Trade and Environment, and the Sustainable Dialogue on the TES, Trade and Environment Sustainable Dialogue. And I must say that, well, before we made the proposal, the reservations and the pushback from our trade partner was very significant. Since we made the proposal, since the elements of the proposal, as I described them in the presentation, making sure that goods produced in the EU and imported goods are treated the same, making sure that any carbon price paid outside the EU is taken into account, making sure that our methodology takes into account the actual emission of the goods, etc., well, ensure that now we have a much more appeased discussion with our trade partners. And apart from that, we've also had discussions with the WTO Secretariat itself. So yes, of course, it is an important element for us, and it is something on which we have invested a lot of time and effort.
Dan, can I take the floor to go a little bit more in the future? In fact, Yeah, in fact, when you look at WTO, WTO is about the markets, competition, full, fair competition. And in fact, when we are dealing with climate change, we are dealing with a negative externality outside the market. Mm-hmm. And so, it cannot be taken into account by institutions, which in fact has to be sure that there is fair competition. For example, if you put a price of carbon, and some countries don't put a price of carbon, okay, but it's how do you introduce that? It's very complicated. So my guess is that one day or another, the question will be on the table, which is the creation of a climate world organization, in order to see globally the rules to apply in order to face this huge challenge where life on Earth is at stake very seriously.
Thank you, Edmund. And perhaps some other panelists or other folks would like to react to that. Stephanie?
Yeah, just to complement that, even though it is true, Jürgen, that many countries or policymakers have decried the CBAM as a potentially protectionist measure, as a person that works a fair amount with developing countries, it has been incredible to see just how much carbon pricing has jumped on the policy agenda in developing countries. Yeah. Not just in, policy wonk circles. I'm talking about boards of directors. I'm talking about the media. I'm talking about politicians. My home country, Brazil, all of a sudden is talking about a regulated market. Never mind that it is not a compliance market in any shape or form, but there is so much more action around carbon pricing since the EU announced the CBAM. And it has been really, really, just really heartwarming and encouraging to see. It remains to be seen, of course, how much of this will actually result in real policy implementation and any carbon price that is worthy of the name. But it has had a really strong impact. And I think it is also telling that these countries seem to be sort of assuming that it's going to happen. I don't see much hope that CBAM will fall, and that's why it seems to be really forming a lot of the opinion and the context within which these companies now operate.
Thank you, Stephanie. Any other questions, comments?
Thank you very much, Dan, for this excellent chairmanship of this session. I will just conclude by saying that it was a very, very interesting exchange of views for many reasons. The first one is that the subject itself, CCUS, is extremely important for the future of the planet. The second is that in this meeting, we listen to people coming from the public sector, policymakers or former policymakers, but also from the business community. Nothing will happen without the involvement and the support of the business community. This is absolutely key, and we have to understand that, otherwise the planet is doomed. And the third reason, apart from all the speakers who were absolutely outstanding, and I thank all of you for your contributions, is that this is an event which has been organized by 3 organizations, one from China, one from the US, and one from the European Union. Extremely important, because these 3 organizations belong to the 3 main economic powers in the world, but also the 3 main emitters. And we need leadership in the fight against global warming. We need global leadership. And before we create some kind of a climate world organization and so on, which maybe will never happen. I think that these three blocks, these three economic powers have to take the lead because the rest of the world will follow. Thank you very much to all of you. Thank you to the moderators. Thank you to the speakers. Thank you to you, all of you participants. It was really a tremendous event, and I am very glad that you have accepted to participate.